Okay, I want to thank David Hart for his more than generous introduction. And I have to say that I enjoyed the opportunity to prepare this presentation because it's helped me recount the too many decades that I've been involved in forestry consulting. So today I'm interested uh, in presenting to you a thesis about how timberland has been important, most especially, of course, to Maine and the Northeast, but it has value worldwide. And over the course of my career, I've seen many changes in the patterns of land ownership that I believe will result in better serving the needs of the general population. So, and a little footnote here to explain wasteland, why I use that term. When I first started at Sewall Company, I did a lot of mapping, and I was involved in helping to classify areas within the timberland ownership. And anything that wasn't a forest was generically referred to as wasteland. That has changed. So here is an outline of my presentation, and I've emboldened three areas here, wanting to focus on those because I believe they're of a special interest in terms of describing the trend that I made reference to earlier. This is a current land ownership map prepared by Sewall Company and licensed to people who are interested in having access to it. And if you can see my cursor, below it is an area that's white largely, and this demarcates the areas that are settled as organized townships primarily. There are a few exceptions, and then of course up here in the northeastern portion of the state we have Aroostook County and the potato farming areas. The highlighted key on the right-hand side of the screen describes a color code for the principal landowners. It would be difficult for you to follow patterns during the course of this slide presentation, but this information is available, and the color codes on this map give you an impression of the tremendous amount of area that has been owned by largely timberland oriented companies and individuals. And there are two general classes. There are companies that own mills, or speaking historically, and then there are family trusts that have owned this land since Maine was part of the original state of Massachusetts. So the concept of commons is New England has a New England ring, and if you visited small towns, you'll see an open area in the middle of the town square where they used to pasture horses and oxen, and all of that was intended to provide a necessary resource for the common good. And the same label can be extended to the air, the water, and habitable earth, as the definition implies here. So the expectation is, and I hope I can demonstrate some of this in the course of this talk, that eventually the public will receive, either by paying or as a common right, access to the necessary resources to provide the quality of life that they've come to enjoy. This is a simple sketch pulled from the internet, which displays some of the many rights that accrue to fee simple ownership. And fee simple ownership gives you, if you look at the left-hand side, the right to mine, to drill, to farm, and that title is enshrined as a paper trail. And then on the right-hand side, you see you have the ability also to exclude, sell, rent or lease, and pass along by will to heirs. So all of these rights guard the concept of ownership. And it's important to recognize that these rights are legally enshrined and provide the basis for deriving revenue for on the part of the landowners, and also paying a tax to the local jurisdiction, whether it's the town, the county, or the state. So the benefits accrue to citizen needs. We've talked about the water. We talked about the ability to pasture animals in the local town square. And there have been instances when people have looked to obtain firewood and other necessary resources. And there is, in the new environmental spirit, the opportunity to enjoy open space and the ecological and environmental benefits that we've all come to realize are critical to our quality of life. So wood we take it for granted as a standard element in our quality of life here in the Northeast. We might feel differently if we were in a desert area, but there is a documented thread provided by wood as it has helped to accelerate a pathway to a more civilized world and a higher standard of living. Whether it's wood that's used as a tool handle, or a spoke for a wooden wheel, or a sleigh, all of these things contribute to the manufacture of goods that are necessary for us to survive. And over the course of years, this has progressed from solid wood to manufactured wood, saw timber, beams, and of course sawdust for animal husbandry. And you'll find that this use of the forest is directly displayed here in this graph, taken from a favorite book of mine, The Hill Country of Northern New England. And the percentages are on the left-hand side, and the dates across the x-axis on the top. If you look at Maine, Maine is the graph with the highest, position on this chart. And that indicates that overall, the original forest land was least impacted as a percentage in New England compared with, for example, Connecticut, where a significant percentage of the original forest area was consumed by roads and farms and townships. And this impact here, you can see netted out in Maine at something shy of 30%. So it's a significant impact overall on the open area of the state. This is another map that was drawn from a book by Mr. Perlin. And at the time it was drafted, a very significant reason for going into the forests of New England was to look for white pine. You can see the cross-hatched area identified as white pine, hemlock, and hardwoods. But white pine was by far the more significant resource. And going back to colonial days, there was the King's Broad Arrow, which when slashed across a tree, a white pine, indicated that that tree was of sufficient quality to serve the naval stocks, and would have been harvested intact, obviously without the limbs, but hauled out to a seaside location so it could be converted to masts for sailing ships. Very important element early civilization. As we've moved from solid to manufactured wood, we're now at a stage where industry and the chemical geniuses are able to take advantage of the chemical composition of wood. And this is an article drawn from a recent newspaper release that talks about a company named Biofine contracting with Sprague Resources to manufacture a zero emission heating oil. And this is an attempt, of course, to recognize that there are green fuels that can be created and other chemical elements can be derived from simple wood and from cellulose. So this is an important development, and it's noteworthy that it's happening here in the state of Maine. So the takeaway here that wood is essential. Wood, of course, from the original forest resides in a majority interest here in Maine under the ownership of timberland individuals and forest primary wood processing companies. And there's been an evolution in the use of that wood over time. Oops. So moving from the colonial days when settlement occurred on lands that had previously been occupied and owned, although it was a different form of ownership, by Native American groups. And you find that the Penobscot Nation, the Passamaquoddy tribe, Holton Band of Maliseets, and I believe also the Aroostook Band. These are the groups that we recognize today as having had control by their form of ownership of those lands prior to the settlement and the creation of a cadastral system, which I will speak about later. Please. This is the one slide I have featuring Senator Mitchell, so please make note of that. This is a settlement that occurred in Maine and during the term of President Carter, and you'll see Governor Brennan, Senator Muskie, Senator Mitchell, and then representatives from some of the Native American groups. This is an effort that was initiated largely due to some pressure applied, some lobbying on the part of it's the Aroostook Band of Micmac. I'm corrected by one of the attendees. Thank you for that. So this settlement was achieved because of lobbying and influence that was fortunately resulted in some landmark monies being provided by the federal government to create both trust land and fee land. Next slide, please. And I'm a little handicapped because I don't have the pointer, but if you look at the color code on the right margin, you'll see that there's the Passamaquoddy tribe and the Penobscot Indian Nation. And this map, I'm fairly certain, is available by contacting the Maine Forest Service in Augusta. Sewall Company does provide this also, but because we're a business, we get into the matter of licensing the map. But the map can be generally found, and I'm sure that without a lot of effort, you'd be able to retain this type of information for your own analysis and benefit. Next one, please. I also make reference to this organization because I want to reference the fact that nations and tribes throughout the states and the First Nation tribes in Canada are making concerted efforts to manage, to own, to manage, and to exercise sovereignty on their various properties, their land bases. And it is appropriate that, frankly, that they continue to push for that, and it may be that eventually their rights can be fully expressed as we look to influence and inform the culture, as we have witnessed, just for example, with Black Lives Matter. So this is an important matter, and it's, again, part of this push and pull tension that is evolving around land rights. So there may perhaps be a time when we have what has been referred to in other situations as a truth and reconciliation moment. Moving to the next one, please. This is a repeat of my prior statement. Native Americans have had preeminent occupation of America, and this will continue. And one quick footnote here, I just finished reading a book about the Vikings, and it's instructive that back in the 700s, 800s, they, moving to a portion of Newfoundland, encountered some Native American groups who fiercely opposed them, and that seems to have discouraged their westward migration. So that's an historical comment. Next one, please. Next slide. Okay, now we come post occupation of the lands by the Native American groups. We come to the cadastral system, which is a fancy French word meaning that you register your title. And this is the mechanism by which society has recorded title so that land can be sold and passed along to future generations. Next slide, please. This is a very simplified map showing counties and townships or civil divisions within the state of Maine. And if you look at the many odd shapes that immediately border the ocean, you'll see that there's any number of odd configurations. As you move up the state, you can see that largely the state is divided into townships that measure approximately 6 miles by 6 miles. So you have somewhere between 24 and 25 or 26,000 acres in any one of those townships. The townships, when they were constructed, when they were surveyed, in fact, which is a more important comment, when they were surveyed, town lots were also established, embedded in those townships. The intention there was to create a source of revenue to fund a church and a school. It was there was no reference to denomination. There were assumptions made at the time, but and those town lots became a matter of litigation in the late 70s and early 80s. If I'm remembering correctly, Lloyd Irwin would have been in state government at the time, may even have had a role in helping to settle some of that issue. Eventually, the companies that owned or assumed rights in those public lots traded with the state and settled so that the various lots could either be incorporated into their ownership and or traded. Next slide, please. So this statement may seem a little controversial, but the pattern of ownership within the unorganized townships, I referred earlier to the bundle of rights expressed by that one symbol where you have a whole range of rights, and these owners resisted anything but leases within the realm of their ownership. They didn't want to allow incursions into the land. They wanted to try to protect it so that they could undertake the principal sources of revenue in owning the land, and that would have been harvesting timber and in some cases water rights. And in some cases, of course, the rivers served as the avenue by which the water rights were excuse me, the avenue by which the timber was transported to market. So another important element to discuss here is the type of ownership, and it was referred to as common and undivided. That is a model of ownership that was adopted from the shipping industry. When landowners when ship owners sent fleets off, coming and going, in order to reduce their risk, they found a way to set up shares of ownership so that an individual or a company might own 10% of a ship. And in that manner, of course, they could spread the risk out over any number of ships. Well, that same model was carried into timberland ownership, so that if there was fire or theft or some other calamity, their risk would be absorbed amongst all of the owners of shares. That is a pattern that has diminished substantially, especially in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, as people consolidate ownership and try to eliminate the influence or diminish the influence of minority rights so that they can transact more efficiently. Next slide, please. Okay, now we get into what I've termed the industrial timberland, and the terms aggregation and dissolution may sound a little strong, but you'll get my point in a moment. The aggregation is, of course, the assemblage of tracts of timber. And when I started my career in the 70s and into the 80s, there were a number of people whose assignment was to buy land and to absorb that land into the corporate entity. Diamond International would have been a prime example of that. Oxford Paper would have been another example of that. Great Northern, all of the largest timberland owners were all about trying to absorb land so that they could diminish the influence of people who had inholdings in their land, and also to make it more efficient in terms of constructing roads, harvesting timber, paying taxes, et cetera, et cetera. The dissolution comes to the next phase, which we'll get to after a moment. So the next slide, please. During the height of industrial land aggregation, it was important to move through the forest and help to impose efficient forest management. And some of that efficient forest management was approached by very large scale harvesting operations which oftentimes were clear cuts and which later engendered a lot of resistance on the part of the environmental community. This is a coring feller forwarder. And for those of you who are curious, you can drive to Lincoln, and as you approach Lincoln from I-95, within a mile of the river, you'll find on the right side, on the south side of the road, a coring feller forwarder that still sits there in its glory. I think you'll find that W.T. Gardner that owns it will discourage you from climbing on it, but you can fantasize about the tremendous impact that these machines had during that very aggressive forest management period. Next slide, please. Oh, I want to say that was in a book that Lloyd Erlin authored entitled Wildlands and Woodlots. So kudos to Lloyd for that. Forest products. This is an assemblage of, I believe from the same book that Lloyd published. This is an assemblage of the profile of forest products that were yielded from the forest. And you'll find that the two top ones, saw logs and veneer logs, are of course the most valuable. But in terms of quantity, the largest is clearly the pulpwood category. And then the others are fairly incidental. Small footnote, Pete Lammert, who was a an employee of the Maine Forest Service during that period, would always pull his hair out trying to figure out how much firewood was being harvested, an elusive number. Next slide, please. And here's another testament to the time and the way things change. This is an enumeration, again from Lloyd's book, of the number of pulp mills and paper mills and integrated mills that existed across New England at that time. And it's a good basis for a trivia game about what remains in Maine. And what remains is a very small number of large mill primary wood fiber-based facilities. So the forest that was at one point labeled the paper plantation by Ralph Nader and his group had to evolve into something other than simply a pulpwood plantation, and the forest industry worked hard to try to convince the state government and the citizenry and the workforce throughout the state that there is life yet in the forest. Next slide, please. The takeaway here, as I phrased it, investment hedging and speculation buffered forest resource. Well, what do I mean by that? Investment hedging, the banks required some of the mills to demonstrate that they owned and controlled a sufficient quantity of wood to provide furnish for the mill if, for whatever reason, they were not able to buy it on the open market. The point about speculation buffered the forest resource is that there were people beginning to see holes in corporate ownership. In fact, there had been, and I was remiss not mentioning earlier, there were family groups, trusts, Seven Islands, Prentice and Carlisle manages trusts for several families. These are family units that decided that they would retain the ownership without necessarily aligning directly with a production facility that would absorb the fiber from the lands. So there began to be a group of investors who were able, on a reasonably large scale, to invest in wood. And as the pulp and paper mills primarily looked at their options, some of these other entities stepped forward. Next slide, please. Timber is a fungible asset. Well, this is where we get to the exciting part of the story. Next slide. I never met Sir James Goldsmith, and I don't know if anyone participating in this presentation did. We did meet at Sewall Company several of his representatives. And he had the wisdom, I'll call it that, to look at the balance sheet for Diamond International and quickly realize that here's the mill and here's the mill site and so forth. And then way down here at the bottom of the sheet is a quantity that is assigned to land. Well, it was a common trick, not trick, but it was a common measure at that time to keep the value of land at a reduced rate. That is to say, oftentimes the rate at which the land was originally purchased, rather than the value of the land as it had appreciated to the current time. So he wound up buying Diamond International and then later Crown Zellerbach, and made a substantial fortune on the unrealized value of the land and the other assets. For him, it was a tragedy because he never lived to be able to spend his money. I make no judgment about that. Next slide, please. So then we get back to the point of other interested investors in the land. We come to the REITs, and REITs, as most of you on this call realize, are real estate investment trusts. And it was at this time following the model of Sir James Goldsmith, and in inserting another phrase here called the timber put. The timber put is something that Sir James Goldsmith used to make sure that as he stepped forward to invest in the land, there was a lower threshold which he could be assured that the land value would not drop below. And there were companies, insurance companies, that said, well, gee, we can sell a put and it might cost a few $1,000,000, but it guarantees that the several $100 million of value are not at jeopardy of being a loss. So REITs started to be formed, and this became a mechanism to solicit investments from individuals, from insurance groups, from teachers unions and firemen's unions and police unions and the landscape. And in Maine, this process led to the next step. Next slide, please. So then we realized that the REITs have the money to invest, but then somebody's got to manage it. And this is where we come to the TIMO, the Timberland Investment Management Organization. Several of these formed with initial management of properties in Maine and throughout the Northeast. And as I said at the beginning, these have expanded now to nationwide and worldwide organizations with a great deal of influence over the future of forest resources as they affect the free world economy. So their strength, as they brought it to the fore, involved using scientific forest management and the tools that had come to be critical to effective scientific forest management to advise the owners about suitable ways to derive revenue, to maintain the value of the resource, and as importantly, to make sure that the results of inventory analysis and valuation could be reliably reported to the investors. The money people wanted to make sure that they had a true understanding of the risks that were associated with their investments. It was an opportunity of mine back in the 80s to help describe to a stockbroker in the Bangor area what these trees were all about. He was surrounded by them, but never had been approached previously about investing in them. Next slide, please. This is one example. This happens to have been prepared by Ernest Bolin, whom many of you have heard of, at Sewall Company, and it represents graphically the results of a modeling projection process. The little window in the center there gives 5 choices. You can employ herbicide, pre-commercial thinning, heavy harvest, a moderate harvest, or a light harvest, and the attendant results are represented on the graph above. And this is the kind of integrated effort involved in taking all of the measurements that are attendant to being able to report an accurate volume measure to the managers who are going to supervise, oversee the harvesting and the management, and necessarily to the accounting group who's going to have to report out projected revenues and report revenues to the owners. Next slide, please. This is too small to read effectively, but on the left-hand side, you have one sheet that shows the species and the products, and then gives you estimates of the stalking on this particular tract of land. So you've got, for example, balsam fir, high quality, 1,000 board feet. If you want to know the certainty of that estimate, you then go to the right-hand side where there is a statistical report, and the statistical report recites the coefficients of variation and the standard error associated with the estimate that was employed. And I can read it, but you may not be able to. At the very bottom, you'll see that there's a total cords per acre. And I believe if I had my glasses on, it'd be 24.6 cords per acre with a standard error of 5.8, it looks like, percent. So that 5.8 is a critical factor for the people who are judging the risk. The 24.6 is a critical factor for those people who are trying to compute revenue expectations and allowable cuts and the many other aspects of management. But the beauty of all of this is that the ability, or excuse me, the availability of investors with the money and the intention of investing was met at a proper intersection as the ability to track the inventories and devise management plans matured given the advent of critical tools. Next slide, please. And one of the critical players in that effort to produce reliable numbers for forest industry and owners happened to be ESRI or ArcInfo. And they developed a geographic information systems, GIS, which made use of GPS, global positioning systems, and imaging, all in a magic brew that was frankly tantalizing to those of us who were used to producing maps with a great deal more guesswork. Suddenly we had the benefit of tools which could give you acreages to the illusory point of thousands of acres, and that of course was a fiction. But the important thing is that that you had the ability to represent the lay of the land. You knew where the spruce was, you knew where the roads were, you knew where some of the non-forest features are, which I should make note, my title referencing wasteland, as the ability to map and locate features became more mature. The features were no longer wasteland. It was no longer the miscellaneous burden that you had to pay tax on. Suddenly it is something that acquired ecological value. And it isn't as if it was magic that it happened that way, but it did. And the beauty of this is that this is where you also began to see interest mature on the part of some of the environmental organizations. Next slide, please. So now we enter conservation and economics, as I've phrased it. The conservation community had been interested in making sure that public needs were being met. And this is back again to the notion of a tension between the private owners and the public good. Well, as we have found, many of us have participated in this effort. Next slide, please. You have tools that emerge to secure the rights, part of those bundle of rights, to protect the land. And the conservation easement became a popular tool. And the conservation easement would protect, as you see on this slide, some of the items there: wildlife habitat, vernal pools, any number of pieces of land which by themselves did not have economic value to the landowner, whose original principal interest was in generating revenue from harvesting. Now you had a source of information about wildlife habitat. You had a source of information about possible acres that could be applied to mitigation efforts, and a much richer opportunity to inform philanthropic people about what they would achieve and how they might achieve a return on their investment, not necessarily an economic return, but a meaningful concern given their interests. Next slide, please. This is only one example. I know Karen Tilburg's on the call representing the Forest Society in Maine. Andy Cutco's on the call. There were many of you have been involved, perhaps locally in your communities, to help secure the conservation rights through conservation easements, through outright purchase, through any number of instances. And this is referenced as a landmark opportunity just because of the size of the properties which were protected as a matter of this effort. Next slide, please. This slide is a pandemic casualty because I was not able to meet and interact with the GIS specialists who created it, but this is just a small example of some of the conservation easements. There are many that can be found throughout the state, represented by 10 acres here, 15 acres there, and then in some cases the massive protection efforts. 7 islands, in fact, protected almost all of its land in one effort. So kudos to them, and kudos to the people who created the opportunities and the measures by which to accomplish this. Next slide, please. The Passamaquoddies, and this is where we move to another phase, and this is carbon sequestration. I want to say that Sewall Company was privileged to have a role in conducting the inventory that allowed the Passamaquoddy tribe to achieve the acknowledgement as Project Developer of the Year. And this is an example of efforts now that are well underway around the world to identify means by which landowners and land managers can demonstrate their ability to reduce harvest, or in other ways manage the lands so that carbon is accumulated. And the carbon is accumulated for periods of 25 years, 100 years, sometimes into perpetuity. That's a big number that I don't have the ability to project on the screen. But suffice to say that this has become a very important tool for conservation, and it does lead ultimately, of course, to providing some measure of support for people who are trying to confront climate change. Next slide, please. So conservation has found that it can cultivate investors. They have the ability to compete. That's an important word, to compete with private investors who might otherwise be interested only in buying the land for timber revenue or for some other purpose. Next slide, please. So we come to the end here shortly. Thank you for bearing with me. This is a compare and contrast. This is the document created in 1974, published in 1974 by the NADA group, and it assaults the comfort zone of the generation of big mills and large landowners. And it was not, in fact, a polite assault. So let's move to the next slide. A counter to that, and an attempt to convince the state of Maine and the citizens and the people who derive their income from it that the effort to convince the state that pulpwood wasn't the only opportunity out there to generate revenue and create jobs. It is equally important that you recognize that innovation has been occurring on the part of forest landowners and mill owners, and they're trying to address this. So let's move to the next slide. One more to go. So the paper plantation alleged that the rivers of wood, water quality, CO2, pulpwood peonage, and corporate land were faults that needed to be addressed, mitigated, or rectified. Now, the pulpwood peonage, just to describe quickly, meant that there was a limited market. There were only so many places to sell, and one might assume that they were all in cahoots and they would dictate the price that you'd get paid for pulpwood, just like the lobsterman complains that he's being dictated to what he gets paid for his lobster. And corporate land, That has influence, or had influence, as judged by the Native group, because they, in their own way, could control the price of wood. Next slide. So this ties it up a little bit, and I'm asked by one of the listeners to mention also the Maine tree growth law, which was an important way also of achieving conservation by recognizing current use. And that's a nice testament to some of the inventiveness of Maine lawmakers. This is just a small list, not necessarily contained in the Maine Forest Products Council report, but additional note is worth making here that we've got forest licensing, Land Use Regulation Commission, Forest Practices Act, there's green certification now, conservation easements I mentioned, and carbon credits. And my final note before I yield to Linda so we can have some questions is that this tension, as I've described it, and I mean that in the most civil way, although sometimes it's not been civil, the tension here is constructive, and the tension has almost always led toward resolution that sometimes is a compromise and sometimes is a total success. The Mitchell Center has the kind of staff to help certify the mechanism by which this dialogue takes place. They have the ability to do the scientific data gathering and analysis to demonstrate that the policies that have been drafted are effectively accomplishing the goals desired, and they have the ability to help lay out a framework for continuing to audit and measure. So that yields my set of slides. So I'm going to turn it over to Linda now.
Okay, can we all, wherever we're located in the world, give David a hand? There are so many takeaways from your really great talk, and I've tried to capture some of the questions that people have asked. Oh, and it's great in the chat. Some people are just putting clap, which is very nice. So one of the great things about what you were helping us learn is just how important it is for us to remember that we're all in this together, that there are so many different players. There's so many different issues. There's so many different kinds of expertise that are important, that all of this needs to come together to have this way that things are working. Do you have thoughts on what you've seen that helps us come together? I mean, you said some really important things, but in terms of that, we're all in this together. Thoughts?
I've been both charmed and very impressed by the capable leadership of so many of these organizations. I mentioned the Forest Society of Maine, the Nature Conservancy, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, Maine Audubon. The list is pages long, and the efforts that they have undertaken. One other example that comes to mind is the Island Institute and some of the work that people are trying to do to find ways to network, common interests. These organizations don't necessarily have the same charter, but they often have overlapping goals. And the bad side of that is they're after the same giver for the same dollar. The good part of that is that by combining the experience and the educational backgrounds of this broader group, you can find a way to achieve success earlier.
Yeah, that's great. That's very interesting. Another story that went throughout your just very interesting talk is how important new tools like GIS and new learning has been. Do you have thoughts on ways we can think about the learning that needs to go on, or the tools and what you see on the horizon at all?
Well, I always have ideas. I'm not sure they're practical. And I have to say that the technology is infectious. It was 10 or 15 years before the purchase of computers could prove to be justified. And if I may digress and tell one story about Joe Sewall, we were relying on the computers at the University of Maine to process inventory. And we'd carry down, in one instance, Kevin Wainwright carried down on the back of his motorcycle several decks of cards in boxes that are yay long and wide and thick. And in one instance, he stumbled as he got to the computer center, and of course, the order of the cards was all over the deck. Well, we then moved and found the courage to address, or one might politely say, assault Joe Sewall about spending some money to get some computers in-house. And we had a finance committee every month, and we bought a computer. The next month, we asked for another computer, and Joe, who was not confined to the use of a civil tongue, made darn sure that we understood that we didn't need another blankety blank computer. We had just bought one. So, but back to the point of the inventive ability of people, the allure of modern technology, the ability of some of these giants to share their reference Tesla, of course, sharing the patent information. All of that contributes to solutions, but people have to be persistent in looking for the proper tools. And beta and VHF, there will be competition, and some things will fall and some things not. I have another brief example, and that is that we were approached by people who had promises that were spectacular. You didn't have to look very far under the curtain to understand that it was just a pipe dream on their part. So these technologies have to go through the normal rigor of being tested in very awkward conditions, and tested to the point where, as one of my bosses used to say, pretend that you're going to be testifying in court. And you've got to address, you've got to be able to explain in a satisfactory way the credibility of the results that you're offering. So.
That's really, I mean, it's just striking all the different ways that you were able to convey to us all the different, sort of interacting pieces of this complex situation. There are a number of undergraduates and graduate students who are listening to you today as a part of the audience that's there. And I bet they would be interested in your thoughts about what majors you see as important for people if they wanted to really make a difference here. I mean, we could think of forestry and economics and the business school and math, history, environmental sciences, GIS. Any thoughts about what people might want to do and how they should learn from each other? Do we need to have students who are working in these different areas getting to know what somebody else is learning?
Absolutely, to all the above. The only Renaissance man I know out there is Lloyd Erland. The rest of us had to inform ourselves independently as much as we were able, participate in real projects as much as we were able, or asked or ordered to do, and then find people with whom we could network or align ourselves to bring in the skill sets that, for whatever reason, we weren't able to support and supply. It turns out to be a very complicated world, and you have to, first of all, pass the straight face test. If early on, I was taught in my career that you make an assumption about the answer, and then you set about disproving it. so that you have so that you have tested yourself. And if you believe that you can rightfully support a case, an argument, a solution, then find somebody else who knows more about the problem or a possible tactic to achieve a solution, and go to them. This is the age of transparency, and the ability to politely and civilly offer critiques is absolutely critical to solutions.
Very, very interesting. So you mentioned Lloyd Erlin, and in your talk, you had a slide that was from his book. Yes, very good. And you also mentioned a book about the Vikings that you had read. And so we were wondering whether you have some book recommendations. So if we're not as knowledgeable as you are, but we want to understand the forests or the timber or the history, do you have some recommendations for us?
I will happily supply a short list. But sitting here right now, one of my favorite recent reads is Dark Emu, E-M-U. And the one about the Vikings, the people of Ash and Elm. Those are gripping page turners. So you see, I'm retired now, so I don't have to read reports. I get to recreate when I read. I'll supply a list.
Great, great. Another thing that you had was a wonderful picture of the, I won't get this pronounced right, but massive coring feller forwarder.
Yes, yeah.
So what kinds of big equipment or important equipment have you seen that really played an important role, but maybe don't anymore?
Well, there are still pieces of equipment styled after the coring feller buncher or feller forwarder. They are more ergonomically safe. They are more efficient. They are less costly to maintain. All of these things are important elements to support the safe harvesting of timber. And there are proponents participating in this. Jake Meyer is one individual who has helped to speak out about the ability to harvest with minimal impact. And that comes back to the gesture of challenging each other and having peer review tours. The Society of American Foresters, the SAF, I'm certain that Jessica Leahy at the university is helping to promote these things there. All of these efforts to examine better ways, better methods, eventually bring in the people who manufacture the equipment. And I also want to say there was I'm drawing a blank here on Certified Logging Professional Program, CLP. That was another item which I didn't mention, but the industry worked hard to make sure that safety concerns were paramount, not only for personal injury, but of course for the attendant costs of insurance. And I think it's fair to say that we all have a holy responsibility to fight insurance companies. So let's accept the fact that there are risks, but let's also accept the fact that we have, if we consciously attempt to do it, we can control some of those risks and bring it into mods which are predictable.
Great. So I should have listed engineering as one of the other disciplines too. Your talk was just so great, and I think we are all going to leave the talk thinking about, we assumed that the forest issues were over here, the timber issues didn't have anything to do with us, but we may be investors, We may be people who use the easement areas. We may be thinking about the future of Maine, and we may be a city councilor or something. And I think your talk has been just so helpful to all of us to recognize we have a complex, really important asset with lots of opportunities and lots of challenges. And the only way we're going to solve some of these problems and continue to have Maine be a great state is to learn from people like you. So if we can all give you a clap again, and thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.